Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be here with you all and with this great group of panelists. Today, we'll be discussing the topic of shifting mindsets and practices, the changing role of global development organizations. We've got a great group of folks here lined up for us, and we're very, very happy to have you all joining with us. Before we go ahead and get started, just wanted to say a quick thank you to Humentum's industry partners. These group of organizations and companies provide a lot of support services to our members and also make events like these possible. So thank you to our industry partners. In terms of housekeeping, we have an open chat, so please feel free now to introduce yourself, maybe say who you are, where you're coming from, and why you're interested in this conversation. And please feel free throughout the webinar to drop questions or comments, musings, thoughts, all in the chat. We'll try and incorporate that into our discussion. Subtitles are available. You can click the closed caption button below. And we are recording this event, so you'll receive this in a follow-up email along with all the presentations from our lovely panelists today. And without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague, Kim Kazinskis, who is the Director of Organizational Transformation at Humentum, to moderate this event. Hi, Kim. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I am very happy to be here, happy to have this discussion. My job here is to introduce this topic, get us all situated, and then really hand it over to the folks who are going to be sharing their work with us today. So as Jenna mentioned, my name is Kim Kazinskis. I am the Director of Organizational Transformation at Humentum. I also wear the hat of Project Director of the Time Initiative, which really has a lot of intersections and commonalities with the discussion we're about to have. In my work, I often get asked the question, are INGOs actually making progress? Why is this important? What are they doing? And I think that's really what we're trying to get into in our conversation today. The reason that we want to highlight this particular group of actions is because INGOs play a really special and important role in the shifting power movement. They hold a relatively large set of positional power. Oftentimes, INGOs are the ones who are both influencing and managing up and influencing and managing down, or passing power up and down. And in that space of positional power, there's a whole lot of potential for change. And so we know that INGOs are going to continue to have a role to play in global development, but increasingly we are also recognizing that those roles and structures are going to look very different. So when I get asked this question, well, are they actually doing anything? Is progress being made? And if so, how? Really, when folks ask me these questions, the implicit question is, well, what can I do? How do I start? And so this panel that we are about to have really came together because there are a lot of things happening. There is a lot of action going on. And so some of those things that folks are trying may not work. Some of them may move the needle only slightly. But what I have seen, a tremendous amount of energy and thought is currently going into change. And so 4 of those organizations who are currently experimenting with that how of big transformational change came together, and they proposed getting together and having this conversation. They actually did the vast majority of the work in pulling this space together. So the goal today is to shine a light on what they have to say. We are going to be hearing about practical tools to inform and benchmark progress. We are going to be hearing about how equity can and should permeate all of the work that gets done. We are going to be hearing about the importance of both mindset shifts and practices in systems change, and then the balance and the tension that exists in doing so. And so really it's all about answering the question of how. What are practical examples of how progress is being made, and recognizing that there is no one right way to do this, but that the more that we learn and share from each other, the better off we will all be. So that's really the goal of the next hour and a half. And what we would like to do is start with you all, those of you who are listening in, to get a sense of where you are and both in your thinking and frankly, in your optimism or lack thereof of this moment in time that we find ourselves in. So we have a very short three questions we're looking for you to provide input on. Jenna is going to put the Menti, which is a polling service, information in the chat. If you can either click the link or go to menti.com. I think it's menti.com, Jenna.
Yes,
And click the link in the chat, and it should take you to where you need to be. And what we're looking for you to do is to rate how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10 is being the most optimistic, and 1 really is not optimistic at all. And the first question is, how optimistic do you feel about the current trajectory of INGOs in general? And then the second question is, how optimistic are you currently feeling about the trajectory of your organization that you are working for? And then finally, how excited are you personally about doing the work of organizational transformation, power shift, advancing locally led development? And these are questions that we've at Humentum have been asking a whole variety of audiences over the last few months. And it's been really interesting to see the variation. And so what I'm seeing here as folks are answering and providing input is that this, not surprising to me, the broad thinking about where INGOs are is, I would say, neutral, middling at best. But thinking about your particular organization, there are more positive feelings. And then even my hunch is that how excited or optimistic you feel about how you are doing the work depends on what space you occupy in your organization. Maybe even how much control you have over what you can and can't do. So we'll leave the poll up so that you can continue to provide your feedback. But thank you all. I think this is the way for us just to get a sense of where folks are. And I'm hoping that the folks who are going to be sharing today took part too, and it'd be interesting to hear what their sense of optimism is. So let me go ahead and introduce the speakers before we get started. We're going to start with Karen Timmermans, the technical manager at Unitaid. We will then hear from Grace Boone, program manager of Stopping as Success, who works with the CDA Collaborative Learning. Then we will hear from Dines Kasungami, project director for the Global Child Health Task Force and Reimagining Technical Assistance Initiative at JSI. And finally, Vajra Allen, the Associate Director of Project and Portfolio Management and Equity and Programming Lead at PATH. We are going to be hearing from each of them. They'll be sharing a little bit about what they have been doing, and then we will open space up for a conversation, a discussion. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, and I'll be kind of monitoring those and pulling them in for our conversation towards the end. So with that, I think we can go ahead and start the discussion with you, Karen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim, and thank you to the organizers of this important webinar for having invited Unitaid to take part and to speak here a little bit from the perspective as a donor. Since Unitaid's creation, equity really is very much at the core of our work. It's sort of in our DNA, if you want. But I do think that one of the things that definitely seems to have shifted is I think that we are more explicit about it and maybe a little bit more outspoken. So if I can have the next slide, you will see our current strategic framework. And as you may notice that if you look at the vision, right, the very first word refers to equity, to equitable access. If you click again, it will highlight that, in fact, equity is referred to in a number of places in the strategy. Can you click one more time? Yeah, thank you. So here it highlights that in a number of places we refer really to equity and equitable access, but importantly also is the box that I highlighted in orange, which refers also to inclusive partnerships. And inclusivity, I think, is also increasingly becoming important and increasingly something that we give a lot of weight to. And it refers to, of course, multiple things like to diversity, to including local people, including countries, including communities, having them really play a core role and take the lead in some of the work. In my next couple of slides, I will be showing or try to show how equity is on one hand taken into consideration in the entire process of grant making and implementation of projects. And I will also try to give a concrete example of inclusiveness. So if I can have the next slide. Yeah, thank you. This is at a high level a sort of a summary of the different steps that ultimately lead to a project and its implementation. And the very first area is sort of an internal part that people on the outside don't see it when we are doing the internal preparations. And as part of that, there are multiple consultations we are listening to, and we are speaking with country representatives, whether health ministries, whether nurses working on the ground. We also speak to affected communities, and we very much take their feedback and their input into consideration. We also do a preliminary assessment of what the potential to improve equity might be. And that assessment is one of the elements that informs the decision of our executive board to either proceed with working in a certain area or not. We then move to the maybe more visible part of the process when we have a call for proposals, the selection of proposals for funding, etc. And again, in the selection process, obviously, equity and inclusiveness are part of the criteria, and I would say they're very important criteria actually. When turning from a proposal to a project, again, we get input from multiple parties that is being taken into consideration. And this includes our executive board, where we have countries from the Global South and representatives from Global South countries that are present and that are giving their input. And importantly, where we also have a communities delegation that really gives important and valuable inputs. And then last but not least, during the process of monitoring and finally assessing of the results, we also look at equity, and we try to work on indicators to measure that. Next, click one more time, please. All these steps, of course, equity isn't the same thing across the board. It depends on the disease area, the product, the actual problem, the specifics of the population that you want to work with. So nuanced and tailored approaches are necessary, and we are trying increasingly to develop and to refine them. If I can have the next slide, please. So one specific example, I've taken this example of the involvement of communities, of people who inject drugs in research and research design. And this is in the context of a portfolio of 3 projects working in 10 low and middle income countries. And I think the starting point probably really was the fact that throughout the entire process, and I mean the process that I referred to on the previous slide, Unitaid really made very, very clear that for us, meaningful involvement of communities, of people who inject drugs themselves, was critical. And we didn't maybe necessarily fully know how to go about that, but we knew that it was important and that we wanted to see it. So we just decided to make that demand and to put it out there. The other important starting point, I think, was that when we had the first meeting where really the overall approach to the research was discussed and decided, we made sure that community representatives were present and participated like very much on an equal footing with everybody else. So if you click one more time. Yeah, so that resulted, I think, in an early agreement and a very broad consensus agreement amongst everybody in the room that expert community representatives should be part of drafting the protocols of the protocol drafting groups, and they were part of it, and also in the creation of a community advisory board. That was really important in ensuring like review, feedback, and input from a much wider group of community members. That has also turned out to be very, very valuable. I will not read out all the implications for the process, but if you click one more time, please. I do want to speak briefly to the implications of this approach. And I think the first and perhaps the very obvious one was that the protocol development took a little bit longer. I think that's normal. If you draft something with more people, you need more time. But we have the impression it's still a little bit ongoing, so I'm not yet fully sure, but it looks like that longer time is at least in part and perhaps even fully offset by, for example, less time required for ethical approvals. Another obvious implication is that there were some additional costs involved, but we consider those reasonable. And a third implication that I think is really important is that it was decided that community members should take the lead on part of the research. So not only were they involved in monitoring and in the design, but also really in the implementation and taking lead on part of it. We don't have outcomes yet. The work is still ongoing, but what I can say is that already today we can conclude, and there is really, I think, agreement amongst everybody involved in that, including the academics, the principal investigators, WHO, and everybody else, that we do have better research protocols as a result of the involvement of community members. And I think that is a very, very valuable result and achievement in its own right. And if you click one more time to my concluding slide, I think really that because of this and some other experiences, like we very much feel that our demands as Unitaid on equity, on inclusivity, on community involvement, etc., that they do give a steer to the projects that we support and the partners we work with. And therefore, we feel that we shouldn't shy away from making such demands, even if we are perhaps not always entirely clear ourselves on how to implement them, because merely making those demands can really help to bring the right partners to the table, to shift mindsets, and ultimately to drive change. Thank you very much, and back to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting final point, which is the importance of language and the importance of taking a stand and making a stance, and both what that attracts to and also what it signals. I think oftentimes what I hear is there are no external incentives to change, but the more that there are these external incentives to change, the more people will rise to the occasion. And the other thing that I just heard you say is we don't need to have all the answers at the start. We just need to starting, and I appreciate that as well. I'm interested to hear how the experiences you just shared resonate with Grace, who has been working with a whole number of organizations doing a variety of different transitions, experiments, practices, if you will. So Grace, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, there's so much resonance around, the incentives and time and all of this good stuff that we will get into. So thank you for all of that. And yeah, thank you all for joining. It's lovely to see some familiar faces. I'm noting names of folks who are on our advisory group, organizations that we're actively learning alongside. And then I'll give a shout out to the Decelerator, who is here doing awesome work on transformations in the UK. So definitely give them a look. But it's good to be with you who are familiar and who are new. So I am with the Stopping at Success program, and we are a consortium with CDA Collaborative Learning, which is the organization that I'm a part of, as well as Peace Direct and Search for Common Ground. And we're funded by the USAID Local Faith and Transformative Partnerships Club. So Jenna, you can go to the next slide and I will share, so for the past 7 years, we have been doing research, as Kim mentioned, on a variety of different types of transition processes, transformative change processes with organizations and partners who are going from international to local leadership, whether this is a strategy process, whether it's an ending, whether it's a huge organizational transformation. We've been learning alongside a lot of different partnerships. And to do this, we've not only captured stories of transition that have been successful, as well as really trying to understand what are the ingredients of what it takes to do this type of transformative change well. So we have over 20 tools that we've applied to 12 different partnerships in 30 contexts. Yeah, with the aim of really understanding what it takes to do this well. All of these are on our website and we'll make sure you have the links. I'm not going to read it, but that last slide, just the last bullet here is how we define transition. So really looking at this transfer of power, really looking at change that does result in power shifts is the important part there. So one thing just to sort of frame up in terms of the perspective that I'm bringing is that as we've been doing this for the past 7 years, we've really moved beyond the need to make the argument for why locally led development or shifting power is the right move, and more into very focused on the how. So, how do teams, partners, and organizations plan for and really lean into this type of change that supports power shifts? So what I'm sharing today is really a more comprehensive sort of perspective about global development organizations more broadly, some of the trends, and then the lessons and the tools that SAS brings to this conversation. So you can head to the next slide, Jenna. And I'm just going to talk about the challenges. I'm not going to sit with them very long because we all know them. We've already talked about incentives as Kim and Karen have already discussed. But we really do see that there are limited incentives for INGOs to shift power, resources, decision-making to local and proximate partners, right? We're still in the space of people being fearful about losing jobs, organizations reducing their budgets, concerns about corruption and risk, which we'll get to. The other piece is the limited time for reflection and adaptation. So at the heart of this change work, it is relational and it is individual. And that takes time to really reflect on the meaningful shifts that are needed to address this moment of polycrisis. There is also limited funding. I was taking notes of the cool stuff that Unitaid is trying out, because this type of funding for transformations is really, really limited, especially if we think about the process that it takes organizations or teams to go from what they are to what they want to be, right? That gap, funding that process, finding funding for that is really, really limited. And then the last one is really just about the uncertainty of the future of global development organizations more broadly. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us are feeling this moment of like existential crisis, right? If power does really shift, like what does that mean for my job, my organization, my positionality, my identity? And so that's where we really have to sit with how this impacts us individually and in our teams and relationships. So in the next slide, we'll talk about that, some of the lessons that we've seen. Because we're talking about mindsets and practices, I've split them up in that way. And then the next slide, we're going to get to, some of the resources that we have to get with this. So these are at the broader level intentionally to frame up. But really, with the mindsets piece, from the Stopping as Success perspective, the highlight here really is that a technically perfect transition isn't responsible without the relational or sort of intangible pieces that are really related to mindset. So transitions ultimately are about how people feel, what the vision for the future is for themselves and their communities, and how people get there together. It's a really relational and emotional process. So because this sort of transformation is about people, right, ourselves and our teams, it really takes time to build in reflective practice. How does our work feel? How are we in relationship, right? Like listening to our bodies around how things feel, what doesn't feel good about our work, what do we think needs to shift, where are some things feeling not great with how we partner, and how can we start making some shifts. There's also a need to really strengthen our own capacity around emotional intelligence, being trauma informed, being in partnership. I think we still live in a moment where those really relationship pieces are viewed more as sort of soft skills, maybe not as valuable as the technical pieces. And for us, you know, we really do see those as really invaluable skills that we need to be practicing and strengthening as individuals and as teams. And then the need to reframe risk at the highest level. Right, we've seen that it's riskier to not do locally led development well and responsibly and sustainably because of this moment of polycrisis that we're all living through. And there are some tangible ways to do that we'll get into. But as we think about practices, transitions really take intentional time, planning, and resources. And so for us, one of the main lessons and learnings that everybody can do is really infuse design with transition thinking. So this may be the design of programs, this may be strategizing organizational processes, but the importance of really planning for the end before the beginning. And so having that perspective that things will change. There needs to be a shift, right? What will that look like, whether the program is ending or the activity is ending, or funding is going to come to an end? How can we plan very intentionally for that from the beginning? A big part of this too is developing a transition strategy and a plan, right? That outlines very clearly not only activities but also the roles. Like, how are individual people gonna be shifting? What's that gonna look like? What's the need? As well as the finances to making it happen. We have a rough estimate that it takes about 10% of organizations' operating budget to do this type of transformative change well. And so that takes significant resourcing and planning. And so building that into a plan at the start is a really critical way to make that happen. Or if you can't do it from the start, right, you're already in the midst of a program, how to start? Start now. Start now. And then, of course, as you know, transition, the plan that you put in place is going to change over the course of time. It's never going to stay exactly as you anticipate. And so this is where building in those practices to pause, reflect, and adapt as you learn is really critical. So in the next slide, Jenna, if you can head that way, these are some of the resources that we have to support teams and organizations going through this. So we have 20 case studies that are documenting responsible transition. So when people have gone through a transition and they've deemed it to be successful, we studied that. We wanted to understand why and what then could we translate to working with other types of transition. So we have those case studies that are really nice roadmaps for how this can be done. And then we have 25 tools and resources on financial sustainability, capacity strengthening, leadership, communication, partnership, and power, which are really the core ingredients to having a responsible transition. We have tools on all of them. We also have some resources that are coming out that are revised with learning that we have learned from testing it with the different partnerships that I mentioned before. And so these resources will be coming out over the next couple months and really consolidate a lot of our learning and are worth keeping an eye out for. So in the next slide, just to say, please subscribe to our newsletter. It's the best way to figure out what's coming and to get those new resources straight to your inbox. And then also feel free to reach out to me directly. We are always happy to have a conversation and think about how can we apply the lessons that we have and that we've seen to your transformative work. We're always happy to have that conversation, and I welcome you to be in touch. So Kim, I'll hand it back to you and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Grace. One thing that you said that really stuck out for me is that you can have the most technically perfect change plan, and if you don't have the people on board, it's not going to work. And I think that's where things start to get messy, right? That's where things get complicated because people are people. And I think learning from the experience of others is always a good place to start. So thank you for sharing that. All right, let us move on to Dinas at JSI. We're really sharing about, I think we started thinking about how are you embedding equity, and then what are different lessons learned from many different transition experiences. And then Dinas, you have some really great tools and examples about how practically at JSI you've started to put this into place. Is that right?
Right. Okay. Thank you, Kim, and thanks to the organizers of this very informative event. I am going to share how at JSI we've approached this theme of shifting mindsets and practices, and what that means for our organization in the context of what we've called reimagining technical assistance. So I am going to share first the overview of reimagining technical assistance, and then I'll zero in on a tool that we are using internally. So reimagining technical assistance is a JSI-led initiative. It aims to advance shifts in how health investments are prioritized, how they are conceptualized, how they are funded, delivered, and evaluated. And I wanted to emphasize two things: that we use technical assistance here in its broadest sense. So it includes the money, the development assistance for health, the materials, and the technical knowledge that might be exchanged. And then the second is that the framing was based on a realization that we are not getting optimal health outcomes or a return on investment in economic terms from the investment in health, whether external or domestic. Next slide. Okay. So the reimagining technical assistance, which we just call RTA, is guided by the critical shifts framework. And this framework identifies the changes that are needed to move to a more locally driven, coordinated, and equitable system that will deliver the health outcomes that we want. Now, on the right, you see that wheel that presents the critical shifts. There are 9 of them, presenting a challenge area and a related vision to what better technical assistance will look like. So think of it as a bridge from a challenge to a better vision or a solution. So if you look at this wheel, the inner circle presents the challenge areas, and the outer circle presents the vision. And the color coding, I'll get into that later, groups the critical shifts into 3. But let me just give an example. At the top, the first deep blue critical shift says we are moving from aligning to donor-driven priorities and decision to a new vision, aligning to country-driven priorities and decisions. So the emphasis on decisions and priority setting emphasizes the notion of power. And when we talk about this shift, we talk about shifting power. Who decides what priorities are funded, how partnerships are formed, and how programs are implemented is what that first critical shift is about, just as an example. Next slide. So where did the critical shifts come from? JSI has been facilitating this process for over 6 years. So in the first 3.5 years, this was a 2-phase gets funded project. And then in the last 2 years has been really not a project, but how we operationalize the tools that we created at JSI. But the critical shifts were co-created by actors in the DRC and Nigeria, and these included representatives from the government, from local and international implementers, funders, and community advocates. And then in a second phase, we validated the shifts with additional representatives from 13 countries and experts from the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and USAID. And here I wanted to emphasize the things that both Karen and Grace talked about the incentives and the challenges that we face when we are confronted with the need to shift the power or change to locally led development. All those challenges were highlighted by these different actors and emphasizes the fact that we don't have the incentives to change. But more important is the fact that these critical shifts were not created by one organization, but presents diverse perspectives, and that is important. Next slide. The three groupings focus on one, how we form partnerships, emphasizing trust and accountability, then how we design and implement, and then prioritizing equity and inclusion through community collaboration. Next slide. Okay, now we move to the tool that we use at JSI to operationalize these critical shifts. We've called it a benchmarking tool, and it has an accompanying guidance brief that detail what the critical shifts might look like in practice and offers an approach for us to reflect and then advance our progress. The layout is you have the critical shift defined. So I gave an example of the first shift aligning to donor-driven priorities, to aligning to country-driven priorities. Then you have characteristics that outline what this shift might look like in practice, and then you have the benchmarks that will show whether you're doing anything at all, or you're partly aligning, or you're fully aligning. Next slide. Okay, so here is how you then could use the benchmarking process to facilitate dialogue, reflection, and action, and helping actors work together. Now, the benchmarking process works best if you can bring all the actors together, those that fund, those that implement, and those that are helped by the programs that are implemented. So if we take the first characteristic of this shift, it says needs and priorities are collaboratively defined with key country stakeholders and decision makers and signed off by appropriate government authority. Now, there are three levels of how you might do this. You can inform people, invite them to participate in a meeting. You are not really demonstrating the shift. They can participate and make some decision, you can say partly, and then they can be the decision makers, they can lead and they can own that process. And then you can say, we are fully operationalizing this, this shift. So if you are looking at the work that you are doing, you could ask what is working well with regard to this characteristic of the first shift. What are we doing that supports this outcome? What are some examples of where we are doing this and what can we build on? You can also look at what is not working. Where are we falling short? What have we tried that hasn't worked? What are some constraints? And then you can ask, how can we improve? So then that benchmarking process identifies the gaps, but also identifies the solutions. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So here we give examples of how at JSI we are using the benchmarking tool to inform partnerships, program design, how we assess and document our own internal learning, and more importantly, evaluating and holding ourselves accountable for advancing locally led development. So we have a brief that outlines to ourselves what implementing RTA means. And at the bottom, you have a picture of real JSI staffers actually interrogating the shifts and asking what it means in our organization and in our different programs. Next slide. Okay. Here, I wanted to emphasize that the benchmarking tool is not just for implementing agencies. So our theme is shifting mindsets, the changing role of global development organizations, but this too can be used by others. So here are some examples. A government can use the critical shifts to set expectation and boundaries for how they work with external partners. Funders can use the critical shifts to formulate their programs and the granting process so that they can evaluate how grantees are operationalizing the shifts. Civil society organizations and communities can use it to advocate for change and monitor progress. And then coordination platforms can actually use the tool to align partners around a common vision and expectations. Next slide. Okay, and this is the end, just to say that you can reach out and we can share the benchmarking tool. You can actually use it. You can use the guidance brief and you can provide feedback on your experience so that we can continue this learning process. We also share a website where we have the different tools, the briefs, and also the case studies that we've written from assessing how well we are doing. So I hope this is something that you'd find useful for your own work. Over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I have long admired the wheel that you have all put together, and I can only imagine how much thought and work and introspection went into developing it. So thank you for sharing. Another tool that we are going to be hearing about is Vajra from PATH, sharing your equity and programming benchmarking tool. So I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thank you to the organizers. It's been really wonderful to hear from everybody today. My name is Vajra Allen. I have two roles at PATH. I lead our equity and programming benchmarks initiative, and I'm also an associate director of project management, and I work on vaccine development projects. So I've used this tool that I'm going to talk about today for my own work. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I really love the title of this webinar because it, I think, gets to the core of what PATH was trying to do when we developed our strategy 2025. And I'm going to spend just a minute on this slide because it lays the groundwork for everything we did in terms of our benchmarks. So the center of this strategy is our mission, and that has not changed. You know, we've been focused on advancing health equity since the inception of the organization. The bluey green ring around that is the what we're doing, what our work looks like, and then the purple ring is the how we do it. And so this is the change, what we call our change strategies. So we have equity and health, community-focused priorities, respectful partnerships, and inclusive innovation. And that's really important to like how we design our projects and the work we're doing. And then around that is this skinny blue circle with the enablers. And really core to our work also is diversity, equity, and inclusion, because being really mindful in this space will help us actually execute our strategy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide. Switch over. Thanks. Perfect. So we have developed, once the strategy was launched, PATH spent more time focusing on our DEI strategy, and we launched a DEI strategy a couple of years ago with goals and metrics that we are reporting on an annual basis. And I think this is just critical because when we talk about shifting mindsets and practices, this lays out some of those shifts that we're trying to make internally, like where, what does our leadership makeup look like? Where are staff located? Because we are a global organization. So some of this is shifting people, out of the US and Europe into the countries where the project and the works are really happening. We also developed a gender strategy because in the global health world, gender is so core, and it's really important to have meaningful tools that can help our teams. And so the gender strategy has two aspects. It has an internal focus that's looking at embedding gender equity throughout all of our projects and providing technical assistance and supporting women, our Women at Path People resource groups, but also externally, being thought leaders and making sure that advancing gender equity is kind of always on the table, and keeping that front of mind. And then we get to the equity and programming benchmarks, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time on. But I just wanted everyone to kind of have the overview of the breadth of resources and tools, because our DEI strategy and our gender strategy are both on our website, and I recommend going to check them out. But the equity and programming benchmarks, actually, we can just go to the next slide, I think, and I'll spend more time there. So the equity programming benchmarks were created in response to the development of our 2025 strategy, to help teams embed the change strategies into our projects. And the reason for that is because I think while everyone wants to do the right thing, it can be either maybe the terminology is new, or it can be overwhelming to feel like, okay, what do I do to have respectful partnerships? What does that mean? So we developed some common standards, and the other reason behind doing this was also so that we would have we would be able to look across all of our projects and say, well, where are we doing well? Where is there room for improvement? And also identify opportunities for advocacy and engagement. I think having a structure does really help us, give some concrete examples to changes that we want to make. This tool, I'm going to talk about the tool a bit more, but I just want to highlight on this slide that this is available. It's on our website, and it's available in 4 languages. So please go ahead and check it out. And, we want to make sure that it's available to as many people as possible. And it's required, the way we've decided to implement this at PATH, because I think this is really important when you try to roll out new resources or make change within an organization, is it is actually required for all of our projects to complete this within the first 90 days of an award. So we didn't try to do retroactive, but definitely are working on adoption going forward. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in practice, we took those 4 change strategies, and this is really fairly similar, I would say, and it's structured in a different way, but fairly similar to what JSI did. But we took those 4 change strategies and we broke them down into different aspects of what is equity in health, and particularly what does equity in health mean for PATH and PATH's programs. Same for community priorities, respectful partnerships, and inclusive innovation. And I do want to just highlight our respectful partnerships change strategy, because that's really where the themes that we're talking about, like shifting power to partners, transitioning the work to our partners, strengthening capacity, and investing in respectful partnerships, which that's really what, like making sure who's at the table, that you're getting the right input. And so that is a whole, it's 4 of our 12 change strategies is really focused on that area. And that's how we, are looking to have projects shift their practices in that space. And you can go to the next slide. So this is what it actually looks like. And you'll notice some of the colors are similar to JSI's, but these were sort of developed in parallel. I think they were a bit ahead of us. And but how this gets implemented by each project team is that when a new project comes into PATH, the teams are asked to look at each of the 12 indicators and have a meaningful conversation as a team, and critically look at the project design and say, okay, where do we land across the continuum from low to transformative in each of those 12 areas? And so it may be that in some projects you're really, doing quite well, maybe in this is focusing on marginalized populations, that just might lend itself to that. But in another area, it might be low. And the reason we have all 12 of those indicators and also have this continuum is because we know that not every project's going to be operating at the optimal level. It just might be not enough time or not enough funding. Or I work on a lot of like earlier R&D work where we're not necessarily being transformative yet. We might need to develop some data and and work on improvements or advance that project along till we get to a space where we're actually working more in the field. And so in order to fill this out, they have that discussion, and then give themselves a rating and then document why. So why did we think we were a 2 in this area and a medium? And then also how you might improve. And I think really filling out those 2 form fields and has that discussion is where we really see the change happening. And particularly that how you might improve. And it may not be an improvement that can be made right away, but it might be something that in the next phase of the project or if something changes. So anyway, just wanted to just highlight this because this is really where we see the work happening. And since we've had this rolled out for the last couple of years, you can go to the next slide. I did want to share a little bit of results. We're a very data-driven organization, so we have to have some data. 130 of our projects have actually used the tool and have uploaded it and had it reviewed by our leadership. Our goal is actually for 90% of projects to do that. We started out in the first baseline year, which was 18 months with only 58%. So definitely room for improvement in terms of rollout and adoption. But this the first 6 months of this year, 76% of projects did it. So we're making our way there. And we also had half of projects in that baseline period report that they'd actually implemented one of those changes that we'd identified in the benchmark. And while half isn't really where we want to be, I think that really does show, that this is leading to some action. And then the other thing we're looking at, and we're finally at the point where we have this, is we're looking at trends. So we can say, for our equity and health, for example, we can see that lower red line is the baseline period, and the darker red line, which is a little bit higher, is from the first 6 months of this year. And same with the respectful partnerships change strategy. So we are seeing some ticking up as teams are embedding these equity benchmarks into their work more, but we still have room for improvement. Community-focused priorities and inclusive innovation, we haven't really seen any change. So that's kind of where we have work to do. And I think you can move to the next slide. And I'll just highlight a couple of wins, challenges, learnings, opportunities. So wins, I think teams are really enthusiastic. They appreciate having a structured tool. They appreciate having guidance on what this looks like for our work. And they felt like these were the right indicators for us to be tracking. So I think that's great. And many teams said that they thought that both the gender equity tool and the equity and programming benchmarks are useful at any stage in the project, but better earlier. Challenges: anytime you roll out a new tool, the implementation is challenging. Finding time to do it during project startup or proposals is challenging. Getting everybody's input is challenging. And honestly, just the measurement, it's a really qualitative tool. So what are we learning from it? How are we pulling out other things we want to implement? That can all be difficult. And I think there's still a lot of infrastructure challenges we have, at least in the product development space, in terms of really shifting work completely to our partners. Learnings: all of this takes time. Everyone said that. It takes this in particular, doing something like this, we have to have coaches globally based. We have to have staff time. You have to keep onboarding new people to how your work is done. It's not something, it's a one and done. We rolled out this equity and programming benchmarks and now we never talk, it's everyone does it and it's easy. That all takes time. And a lot of projects are not really funded in a way where they can do everything that they want to do. They might identify a lot of great ideas, ways to be more equitable, ways to get more input, and it's not in their budgets or it's not in the time that they have. And then opportunities, I would say it was already highlighted, but we are at the table with a lot of donors. We need to keep pushing to keep this front of mind. And then we also all have the opportunity, I think, to change ourselves and our own mindsets and our own practices. And we don't need anything for that. So I just want to keep that on the radar that, each of us can make our own incremental change, and that all will have impact eventually. So I'll stop there. Sorry, I think I went a little long. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so let's bring everyone back. Thank you, Vajra. Let's bring everyone back and talk about it. See what comes up. Here's what I have for you. If you have been listening in, what questions do you have? What answers would you like us to start to explore? Please put those questions into the chat. Alternatively, if you have tools, or if you are doing something interesting and exciting, please also put that in the chat so that we can be sharing and learning from you as well. I have all sorts of questions. Maybe I will start as we get a few questions that are coming into the chat. The first one that I have, oftentimes when I do these discussions, I think it's important to start with language, and in some ways level setting with language. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the relationship between DEI and locally led development, and I'll tell you why. As I was listening to you all, I heard a lot of equity, the term equity being centered. I heard locally driven, I heard transformation and transition. And my question is, oftentimes, are these words interchangeable, or are there better places? Is equity, for example, more palatable to start to weave in and permeate the work versus other terms? Or does it not matter because we're all kind of moving in the same direction? So I guess the short question is, what's the relationship in your minds or in your work between DEI, equity, and locally led development? Whoever would like to take that first.
Maybe I can start.
Please.
Kim, and just speaking from the perspective of the stakeholders that were involved in developing the critical shifts. One, it is that, yes, language matters. But I think there was also the sense that we can very easily even impose our language on them, even with good intentions, where we are trying to change the language. We frame the conversations, particularly as international or global organizations that are implementing these development programs on behalf of our funders. So co-creation is the foundation of getting even the language right. And it will be based on the context, because DEI means one thing in the US. DEI means a very different thing in Nigeria, in the DRC, or in Zambia, or it may not even mean anything to them. So I think the message there is we have to be careful so that in that dialogue, that's why one of the shifts, or that grouping of shifts for us that focuses on how we form partnerships. That is where we frame in agreeing the partnership, we also frame the language that we are going to use that speaks to the needs of the different actors and partners, so that when we use a word, it means the same thing. And when it is different, we know why it is different. That is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think I love that practice, Inez, and was going to speak to similar things, so I won't repeat. But I think one of the things from our side, from a project perspective too, has been just the reflection of how much language changes over time, and the importance to be really like in right relationship with how you also continue to evolve your language. And so for us, we have sort of this biannual practice where we go back to our definitions and we think about like, how does that resonate? Where are we hearing, tension with that, or how things are changing? And because this is the challenge, right? I feel like language does change so quickly, and it does mean so many things to so many different people depending on context and positionality and all of that. So for us, we have just had a really intentional practice of continuing to reflect on that and then getting feedback on it from our partners, and trying to gauge as much as we can about how much continues to resonate or not. We have a link to our definitions in the chat for folks who want to dig in a little bit.
Good, thank you. Yeah, and I was reflecting that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, in a lot of the conversations that I had, DEI and NGOs at least was kind of a separate space. And locally led development or power shift was a separate space. And there is a lot of, increasingly I'm seeing overlap, and that comes out in language. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think in my mind, I think it's a signal that much of this is permeating or getting woven through, and that there is rightfully so overlap. Vajra.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was gonna say. I think you really do need a holistic approach. And I think while actually a lot of our tools were developed and our DEI were all sort of developed at the same time and not necessarily together, I think now we're seeing them all come together. And so our DEI strategy is more overarching, and then we've spent more time developing guidance and tools around specific areas in terms of how we do our work. But there's a whole like DEI initiative that's internally focused that is more around sort of the typical, what we think of as the typical DEI stuff that, is separate from this. But I think we do need to keep it, all under an umbrella, because it does impact, especially as we're talking about where our staff are located and what our staff, what community.
You just froze for a minute, Vajra, but I think we got it. Thank you. And another question I had that came up for me as I was listening to you all share was, there's a lot of tensions that come in these large systems change, and so much of what's messy, but what also I think is what others can learn from is how you all have balanced those tensions. So one thing that I heard was the tensions of making systems change that I think is consistent, but then also, I think you mentioned it, Karen, tailored, nuanced, contextualized approaches. So how do the different tools and approaches that you have balance those different things, making sure that you have this framework that is relatively standard, but that you're providing the space to live in that messy space of contextualizing solutions?
Yeah, maybe I could make a start. I think, and maybe let me try to think of the example that I gave of we are trying to have a performance indicator on equity, but a large focus of our work as Unitaid is actually products and access to products. So what we are sort of doing is for every product that we work on, we have a kind of a whole product profile, as we call it, which is an internal document where we try to set out the different issues, where we try to put down where we are at the start or the starting place, and how far we think we can get in making progress. And then we assess that, and then ultimately you could come up with sort of an average percentage of progress for that product. And we then, across all the products that we are working on, we sort of have an average that becomes the overarching indicator. So we're trying in that way to marry between the specifics and still wanting to report on something overall that perhaps most people find more interesting. We're still refining the system, and that is, so for now, it's definitely an internal thing, but that is one of the ways in which we are trying it, but recognizing that the tension definitely is there and that it isn't always easy to do it or to get it right. I hope that maybe others have maybe more specific or better answers than this one.
I can take a crack at it. So I think that's one of the reasons we did end up with 12 benchmarks instead of, what you want to have is like 5 or 1 or something, is that each path is a big organization. We do everything from early research and development on products to implementation and policy change. So we're not going to find, for most of our projects, not all 12 benchmarks are actually going to be a fit. And so that's where we wanted to provide a tool that could be useful to everyone, but there is an option to opt out. And I also think we need to be really sensitive to, and this kind of goes back to the first question. I think when we started developing these, we were in the US, we were in the Black Lives Matter movement, and this was all very front of mind, but we'd be talking to our colleagues in country and bringing up, issues around maybe gender equity or around homosexuality and making sure we have people at the table. And that can create a lot of risk in some countries. And so we also don't want to be imposing, our sort of US idea of what equity or what we should be doing or who we should be engaging with into a country where it might make it risky. Although we want to keep pushing those things forward, we want to just be very mindful and listen to. So that's where, listen to the people who are doing the work. Like that's where we should be starting from. So I think that's why with our benchmarks, it's actually much bigger and broader than maybe you want it to be, but we want it to be applicable and helpful to all of our project teams.
And Dinah, did you have a similar experience?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I was also going just to rehash that we have 9 critical shifts, and at any one time, you expect that a project or a country will look at 1 to 2 critical shifts that are most relevant at the time or to the project that they are doing. That's one. But I also wanted to highlight, like, our critical shift number 5 emphasizes that element of contextualizing, being flexible, and also allows us to, sometimes all we can do is advocate, particularly when it comes to things like flexibility in the funding, flexibility in the timeline. Those are things that are beyond us. But when we apply those parameters, when it is relevant, you can't say we should have a 5-year or a 10-year, rather it becomes then context specific, where I say what makes the most sense here is this much, and then how do we advocate for that space?
That makes sense. And the other tension that I heard you all speaking with, or I think I did, was around time and timing. And I know sequencing is always something that comes up in conversations that I have. So how do you all, or maybe Grace, I can start with you because you've seen kind of the broad gamut of examples. How do folks manage this tension between this desire for immediate change and progress? And I think the reality that most of it's going to look incremental, especially when you're talking about mindsets and practice shifts. What is a reasonable timeline for a real non-performative systems change?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Yeah, I think some of the challenges, maybe just the starting on this with transitions, is that they're typically motivated by some sort of funding or political shift on the INGO side, which comes with some sort of time frame. Like the ending is the funding is gonna run out in X amount of time. And so what we have tried is really to we learn from those, and those are valid because that's the reality, but we also have tried to look for examples where, people as part of their organizational strategy or their partnership principles, plan endings from the beginning. And we've tried to learn, okay, when that's done, when there isn't this sort of restriction or there's not a box to sort of fill, what does it look like? And so we do have a couple partners where that's been the process. And in that case, I mean, it is multi-year processes, and they may set, in 5 years, we want this outcome as a group, and that's what we've decided. And then they'll get into it and they'll be like, oh, actually, that's not enough time, or we didn't quite make it. And so the pivoting. So I think that's where that's some of the ways that we've seen. But I think the thing that I come back to often is, there really is, and this sort of gets back to the incremental shifts piece, where there really is a lot that organizations can be doing in the meantime. We've seen organizations who start doing project level transitions, and then what they learn from that, builds up to an org strategy, which then comes back to be implemented fully. So I do think there's lots of ways that teams can be crafting creative approaches to these transitions, even if there's a short time frame. But for us, I mean, the longer the better. 3 to 7 years is optimal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other experience or thoughts on how long this takes? Or navigating
I was going to say
challenges?
the same,
Yeah.
it takes years. Yeah. And I think it's a couple of there's a few things, like it depends on what you're really trying to shift, like especially if you're trying to shift project to another, there might be a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built up. And at least in the space I work in, we need labs with assays there, we need supply chain set up, we need, there's a whole lot of work that needs to happen to make this possible. And I think we need to, I really love this, like starting with the end in mind, because it doesn't work if in the last 6 months of the project, you're like, okay, so you're going to take it from here, right? We need to be starting with that. But I would agree that even just seeing how this rollout of this tool internally has taken, like we're starting to gain momentum, but we've been doing it for 2 years now. So it's not an overnight shift, and it still takes investment all the time. You can't just say it's done now that it's available on our website.
Maybe just a quick addition to the two contributions reminds me of a conversation with the donors who were part of that second phase of looking at the critical shifts, and they are concerned, and it's valid that we need to show some results in the short term while we are working towards that long term. And I think that that's where the challenge is. And to Grace's point, having the end in mind and then showing that we are moving incrementally towards that. And so being systematic about documenting, first it's having that learning mindset, documenting, and then sharing with as many people as possible, because again, it's often that the people that are in that particular project or team are aware of what is happening, where the challenges are, and what solutions they're applying, but the rest of the team, the organization, and other partners do not know. But sharing and learning together is key, but also having the short term showing incremental progress while making the case that system change, we all know, takes a long time.
Yeah, which is so important for managing expectations. But I love your point of sometimes we get so into the doing that we forget of, okay, how are we documenting this as we go, and making sure that we are communicating and having that learning mindset from the beginning, which again takes time, resources, minds, space, all of the different things. Which gets me into another question for you all, which is what are the barriers to making this work, to making this process of change work, whether that's external barriers like lack of incentives or funding, or internal barriers? What have been the big things where you have found yourself getting stuck?
I know for us, at least initially, it is really time. Like people can feel like, oh, there's just a lot to do. This is just another thing on top of everything else. And so I think you really have to show the benefit of it in order to and I think one thing we did, at least in rolling out our equity and programming benchmarks, was to get some pilot groups going. So, find some friends who could advocate, and then that helps build a little bit of momentum. And also, I think for us, it was also sharing back internally, like, what are you doing with this information? How is this going to change our work? Because if you don't do that, if you ask people to do something and you don't actually show them what you're doing with their effort, it's going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, if I may come in there, I would very much agree with the importance of sharing experiences internally and showing internally that things are feasible, because you get people thinking like, oh, if she can do it, maybe I also can. That said, I think another challenge, and it came up earlier, but I think it's also very much true from our perspective as a donor, is in a way it's much easier still to shift the momentum and the thinking internally, but then the step to implementation can be like one that takes a lot of time. And from a donor perspective, it is because we are funding projects, and yes, you can make new demands or demand things differently from new projects, But you can't all of a sudden close down all your old projects or completely overhaul them, because I mean, it would be like a waste of like a tremendous amount of effort and good work that they are doing. So from the moment you decide internally that you want to do things different, it still takes quite some time until you really reach the point where you can say, okay, now the majority of our projects are doing that. And I think it's normal, it's understood by everybody, but it can still be a little bit frustrating. And listening to you, Dinus, earlier, I was thinking maybe that is partly where the demand comes from that you refer to, that some of the donors want to see some short-term achievements as well. Just even perhaps, and I don't know which donors you're referring to, but also internally to keep the buy-in going and to keep people engaged, that it's actually possible to make some of those changes.
Because it's a whole
Yeah.
ecosystem shift. Grace?
Oh no, sorry, Kim. No, I think one of the things, so we typically work with international organizations who are coming to us who, want support going through a process or have the values in mind, but not quite know how to do it. And so we spend a lot of time working with organizations to actually just articulate what is your vision? Like, what's your goal? What's your end goal? And using that as its own sort of valid, like, what are the limitations we're working with, or what are the realities we're working with, whether it's funding or politics or capacity, and then working really intentionally to take all of that well-intentionedness into a responsible process with partners. Because I think that's one of the things that we've noticed, is that there's a lot of well-intentionedness in this moment of trying to shift power, but when it actually comes to like, let's ground this in the realities of people working in their communities. Let's ground this in the realities of our partners. Like, how can we really be in solidarity with what their vision is and what their hopes are for their future, and how to bring those things together. That takes so much time and intentionality. And then even when it's done well, in the sense of like a transition is planned from the beginning, there is a challenge where we, balancing and like articulating that transition activities are their own set of thing, like they're distinct things that go into a process, and that needs to be held in direct relationship to program activities. And it's really hard to do that, especially amidst program startup when there's so much going on. And so, really trying to set a responsible process. We lean a lot on process. Like, if we have ways that we communicate, ways that we check in, documents we come back to and adapt, like all of this can help sort of address some of that, but it is a lot for teams to hold all at the same time.
So you both, I think all of you have started to get into one of my last questions, which is, from the work that you have done, from the learning that you have done, what strategies would you suggest to others who are on this journey, maybe a little bit behind you on this journey, as they're looking to advance more locally led or equitable programming? What would your piece of advice be?
Maybe I can start and really link it to the last point. It's they need to be comfortable with risk. I think being risk averse for very good reasons is one of the challenges that we have to deal with. How many of our stories center around risk or failure? And sharing what has not worked is an important strategy, because then we avoid repeating the same within our organizations and with others, because really, in terms of approaches, they aren't very different even across organizations. We just nuance them. But if we were explicit about this did not work, and this is what we learned from it, then others would be more open to work on it. And I like to use really the metaphor of parenting, not to suggest that local partners are children, but it's an approach, how you empower your child to be independent, to thrive. And what that relationship entails is that you have to let go, and risk is inherent in that relationship. And yet successful parenting is really about letting out an adult go into the world and thrive, be their own, because you shared the core principles of being a successful citizen. So for me, I think the approach is that what we have are principles, foundational, they are tools, but we have to use them. Sometimes we fail, and acknowledge that it is okay to fail, as long as we build on it. And then when we succeed, we celebrate, and then we move on. Thank you.
I love that, Dinette. And I was going to bring in risk too, so maybe I can just piggyback off of that. And I'm noticing Catherine's question in the chat too about reframing risk, so I'll bring in some of that. But yeah, I mean, I think part of this, especially when we're thinking about global development organizations, particularly international organizations, that there's a lot more that we could be doing to use our positionality to leverage these values around shifting power and these practices around shifting power. And I think that takes a really intense combination of individual work as people, team-based work, organizational practices. So when I'm talking about internal work, that's part of it. And then when we think about the external piece, thinking about like, we learn alongside a lot of partners who have used their positionality to like shift their funders' funding practices, or advocating or like making the case for why certain locally led development practices are needed, why the funding for a transition process is important. We've seen people get grants. We've seen people shift, how funders fund, even in like small instances. And those are really important glimmers for us to really tune into, like, oh, like this is possible. Like we could be doing more to use our positionality to shift the way things are happening. And so we really encourage people to be bold in this, to have a lot of strategies to like strategically use the role of being an INGO to leverage what you're hearing from partners and bridging that gap to shifting funding practices and bringing folks together, right? Like having conversations with everybody, doing that visioning together, and this ability to continue to lean into like, it's riskier to not do locally led development well, right? In this moment of polycrisis, like it is riskier to not be as effective and sustainable as we all can be. And there are roles for all of us to play. And so leaning into those and using our positionality, I think, is a really big part of that.
Sure, I can pick it up from there. I think, I would say internally, I would definitely recommend that groups look at or other organizations look at the tools that we've shared, because a lot of work has been done. So don't start from scratch. And, I'm like, steal it, please. Like, I think everyone wants to share what they've done and help accelerate this work. So I think I would definitely start there. I think the other thing, I really love what both Grace and Dinette were saying about the risk and about, especially if you're writing a proposal, like build in the transition, the shift to partner, and build in the time and the money, and really, force the donors to take it out. Because I think sometimes we don't put it in because we think, oh, it'll drive up the budget or it's going to make the project longer, but it's also going to make the impact more meaningful and more sustainable. And I think, even sometimes I know for myself, sometimes people that, well, we don't want to fund all of this right now, but having it there at the outset at least can build it in. Maybe you get a phase one, and when things are going well, or when, for us as a product, when your product is working well, then it's already in their mind for phase two. Okay, how do we actually transition this? Have we invested in this? Have we put in enough time? So I would just say that too, like we need to be putting it out there so that it's something that is at least part of the discussion. And so, yeah, just really echoing what Grace said. I'll pass it over to you, Karen.
Yeah, not sure I have that much to add. I would maybe just want to say that I feel like obviously can't speak for other donors, but certainly for us in Unitaid, the transition piece has always been really, really key from our perspective, and so we would certainly welcome, and we actually often ask people to highlight that right from the start. But again, maybe this is not the same for other organizations. I can't speak to that. I was also thinking something that you said earlier, Grace, made me think of, we have had a couple of instances, and I'm actually not sure that they were intentional. I think they probably were more organic than intentional, but again, I can't speak for others. But where we had an experience of an organization that initially we got to know as being a sub-grantee, later on managed to get its own grant with Unitaid. And we think that that is like a really nice thing to see that happening. And it is maybe an example of what you were talking about, of INGOs being able to play a role there. Almost like, of course, if it's intentional, maybe that's better. But even if it's unintentional, I would still say it's maybe a good thing. And we have been seeing some examples of that. Of course, we always would like to see more and would like to see it faster. But I do think these things are happening, and maybe that should be an encouragement for all of us to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you all. And and I think that some of your comments here address one of the questions in the chat around risk, which thank you, Catherine, for putting that out there. And I'm also looking at Amelia's question around resources. Yes, there's so much out there. Every day I feel like I'm learning about a new organization or initiative or resource, and I spend quite a bit of time thinking about this. So for folks who this is not your full-time job, I can imagine it feels really overwhelming. So I don't know that I have an answer for you, Amelia, but I want to just acknowledge that, yes, this is a thing. As Grace, you mentioned, this is a conversation that Grace and I have been having regularly about this idea of, wouldn't it be amazing and wonderful if not just was there a place for resources to live, but for shared learning to live and for people to go for this. And it is something that we are exploring. And if there are others who are interested in having that conversation, please do reach out. Because I do think that maybe 5 years ago, it was more scattershot. There seems to be a groundswell in a good way. My last question for you all was going to be, do you feel optimistic? But I feel like we all just ended on a little bit of an optimistic note. So maybe I'll just open it up for any last thoughts that you have from coming out of this conversation or as you go forward. Any last piece of advice, any piece of optimism, that any, as you said, glimmer of hope here for you all to share?
I have one that I thought of sort of over the course of this conversation, is that what I'm really optimistic about is if you look at when Grace started and when Diness started and when we started, this is not a short term, right? Like we're already 5, 6, 8 years in. And so it's not going away and there's still a lot of energy. And so I think that to me is great, right? Because I think sometimes we get these like exciting new initiatives and then 2 years later everyone's moved on, and I'm really happy to see that we're not moving on. So I think that's my optimistic note to leave on.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree, Vaja. And yeah, I do feel like in these times, like hope is a very strategic form of resistance. And so it is sort of this active practice. And when I, really sit with it, I find so much hope and optimism in folks on this call, organizations that we're working with and learning from. Because, when we think about the world we have and the world we want, like there are so many examples of the world we want is happening now. And I think that for me is a really important thing I constantly, as my own practice, have to move away from like, everything's terrible and it's all on fire, to like, there are folks who are doing this work. It is happening. Change is happening. It's happening, and we know how to do it, and we're doing it. And that is a very intentional leaning in for me that that it's possible and it's happening and will continue to make it so.
And maybe the one smallest point that I have to add to that is that I also am very convinced that there is a ripple effect here. It may not be quite as large as we would like it to be, but it's there and it will keep going. Thank you.
My last point is that I think we can't keep the same. The status quo is not an option. And I think we are all agreed. We want change. And as we look towards 2030, where I see it in the maternal newborn child health, we're saying 2030, 6 years, we need to run. And because of that, I think there's just that energy. Embrace the tools that are available. Hey, let's do our best because the status quo is not an option.
Yes, and I think that's a perfect way and end note to end on. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for those who have joined us today. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise and their learnings. Please stay tuned for the follow-up information with the resources in your inbox. And then our plan is to have a similar conversation sometime in October with local institutions, thinking about the learning on that side. So we are actively looking for panelists. If you know of or would like to participate, please reach out to us at Humentum. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jenna, for the awesome tech. Appreciate you all.
Yes. Yes.